Welcome to this explainer. Look, today we're tackling something absolutely crucial for any global executive, and that's strategic leadership. We're going to take some pretty complex decision-making theories and transform them into a real-world, high-stakes survival toolkit for navigating corporate chaos. Because let's face it, in today's wild, volatile global market, making decisions isn't just a basic management skill anymore, right? It's literally the core competency of a senior leader. The choices you make don't just tweak operations, they dictate your competitive edge, how fast you innovate, and honestly, whether your organization even survives. So buckle up, because we are unpacking the ultimate strategic framework today.
We've got a lot of ground to cover. Here's our roadmap. We'll kick things off with rational models and the limits of rationality, then we'll get into measuring risk and strategic modeling, before wrapping it all up with model validation and management in action.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, Rational Decision Models.
Now, in a perfect, pristine academic world, as a CEO, you'd seamlessly glide through these 4 totally logical steps. First, you'd define the exact problem and your goals. Second, you'd explore, meaning you'd gather all the available information out there and build out your strategic options. Third, you'd evaluate every single one of those options and decide on the absolute optimal path. And finally, step 4, you'd execute perfectly and evaluate the results. It's a nice thought, right? It assumes you're this perfectly rational actor just maximizing benefits at every turn.
But here's the massive illusion. In theory, sure, you've got objective analysis, complete information, and pure cost-benefit math. But reality? Reality is messy. The corporate environment is almost never that clean. You're constantly dealing with incomplete data, insane time pressure, stakeholders who want completely different things, and sweeping global risks. Relying blindly on that classical theoretical ideal, that can actually be a strategic death sentence, simply because it completely ignores the chaotic reality of the actual battlefield.
Let's look at a quick retail case study to see how this plays out. Imagine a major retail chain gets hit with a sudden, sharp drop in revenue. Well, if management misidentifies the root problem at step 1, say they just blame it on weak sales staff and blow millions on mandatory weekend sales seminars, they've missed the entire picture. The real issue could be a massive consumer shift toward e-commerce, or maybe their branding is just totally outdated. The point is, if your very first step is flawed, every single decision that follows, no matter how logical it seems, is fundamentally wrong.
Which brings us nicely to Section 2, the limits of rationality. We really have to talk about theorist Herbert Simon and his brilliant concept of bounded rationality. Simon basically said, look, human rationality has hard limits. We don't have unlimited time, our data is usually flawed, and our brains just can't process an infinite number of variables. So what do? We do something called satisficing. Instead of hunting for the perfect, mathematically optimal solution, we inevitably pick the option that hits our threshold for good enough. Think about it. If you need a new CEO for a subsidiary, finding the literal best human being on planet Earth is impossible. So you set criteria, industry experience, cultural fit, available to start in 3 months, and you hire the first person who safely meets that good enough bar. But because we're constantly forced to take these mental shortcuts, we crack the door wide open for cognitive biases. And these biases can severely derail a multi-million-dollar strategy. You've got confirmation bias, where we only look at data that supports what we already think. Overconfidence bias totally skews our forecasting. Anchoring gets us stuck on the very first number we hear. Availability bias means we're over-relying on recent or memorable events. And loss aversion, that just means we are way more terrified of losing a dollar than we are excited about making one. Left unchecked, these biases will literally eat your corporate strategy for breakfast.
Let's move on to Section 3, Measuring Risk. Okay, so let's ground this in some numbers. Consider a massive real estate investment. You're operating with risk, sure, but you can actually estimate the probabilities. Let's say we map out our scenarios. We've got a 30% chance of market growth that would yield $500 billion. There's a 50% chance of a stable market bringing in $200 billion, and a 20% chance the market declines and we lose $100 billion. This is exactly how you map things out to see the true financial landscape of a deal.
Now, if we take those numbers and calculate the expected value, which is just multiplying each probability by its profit or loss and adding them all up, we get a really nice, satisfying mathematical baseline of $230 billion. It's a positive expected value. Looks amazing on a spreadsheet, right? But here is the kicker. Your final call still completely depends on your company's unique risk appetite. A massive global conglomerate might easily risk that $100 billion loss for the potential upside. But for a mid-sized firm, that 20% chance of failure might literally mean bankruptcy. The math gives you the baseline, absolutely, but strategy dictates the final choice.
All right, Section 4, Strategic Modeling.
Enter the OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act. When you're in a highly unpredictable environment, rigid, 5-year plans usually just fall apart. Frameworks like the OODA loop show us that the company that learns and adapts the fastest is the one that actually wins. You observe the market data, you orient yourself to whatever the new reality is, you make a quick decision, and you act. And then, you immediately observe the results of that action and run the loop all over again. In chaos, your speed and your adaptability are your biggest competitive advantages.
And what about when you're managing a huge portfolio of businesses or products? That's where tools like the BCG matrix come in, as a visual command center for resource allocation. It tells you exactly where your money should go. You milk your cash cows, those reliable, low-growth, high-market share legacy products, for all the cash flow you can. Then you aggressively pump that cash into your stars to maintain your market dominance. You carefully place bets on a few question marks that show potential, and you ruthlessly divest or restructure your dogs.
Which brings us to Section 5, Model Validation. So you have to ask yourself, why do we urgently need to stress test these strategic models before we execute? Why not just blindly trust the expected value calculations or that BCG matrix we just talked about?
Well, the absolute crucial point here is that a model is just a simplified version of reality. If you bet your entire company on an unvalidated model, you are setting yourself up for a spectacular failure. Models fail all the time. Why? Wrong core assumptions, heavily biased data, totally missed variables, or just confusing a random correlation with actual causality. A model might perfectly explain what happened in the past, but completely fail to predict a rapidly shifting future.
Let's see how this actually happens in practice. Say you just dropped a fortune on a shiny new AI tool, and it tells you to open 100 new retail stores based on some really incredible demographic and income data. You don't just blindly sign those checks. Why not? Because that algorithm might have completely missed nuanced local shopping habits or informal local competition. So, what's the validation solution? You test the model on 10 diverse locations first. You measure the real-world results, you update your assumptions, and only then do you scale up the operation. You always have to validate the math against human reality.
And finally, Section 6, Management in Action.
Think about being a CEO staring down a massive mergers and acquisitions deal. Keep this in mind. M&A deals rarely fail because the financial analysts messed up the valuation spreadsheets. They fail because executives suffer from bounded rationality and completely ignore the messy human elements. We're talking culture clashes, the mass exodus of key talent, and the agonizing, slow reality of actual corporate integration. You need a decision model that actually accounts for people, not just the profit margins.
And the exact same logic applies to digital transformation. If you're deciding to implement widespread AI or a totally new digital platform, please do not pass it off as just another IT implementation project. That is a huge strategic error. True digital transformation requires a holistic restructuring of your operational strategy, your talent pool, and the entire business model itself. It's a fundamental shift in how you deliver value to the market. So we want to leave you with this final thought. To conquer the chaos of the global market, you cannot just rely on your gut instinct or some overly simplistic spreadsheets anymore. You have to build a decision-making engine within your organization that is mathematically sound, deeply validated, and ruthlessly adaptable. Take a hard look at your organization and ask yourself, is your current decision-making system truly strong enough to survive the uncertainty of tomorrow? Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer, and we will see you next time.